All right, class. So, moving on to our lecture on the cardiovascular system. And for this one, I have already posted a couple of my videos from my anatomy review. And I really encourage you to watch those videos because they talk about the basic anatomy of the heart and blood flow through the human heart. So you might find those videos useful. Okay, so again, quick review on the anatomy. The heart, human heart is four-chambered. You have the right atrium, you have the left atrium, you have right ventricle and left ventricle. The right atrium receives deoxygenated blood from different parts of the body. The deoxygenated blood from the right atrium then flows into the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, the deoxygenated blood moves into the pulmonary trunk via opening of this valve, which is called the pulmonary semilunar valve. I'll talk about the valves a little later. So let's review one more time. From the right atrium to the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, the deoxygenated blood goes to the pulmonary trunk. From the pulmonary trunk, the blood travels to the lungs. We have the lungs here via these vessels, and these are called pulmonary arteries. And in the lungs, as we know, there is gaseous exchange. All the carbon dioxide is dumped out. The blood picks up fresh oxygen and comes back to the left atrium via, let me see if I can change color. It comes back to the left atrium via pulmonary veins. There are 4 pulmonary veins. You see 2 on this side, and then there are other 2 behind the heart. So the left atrium gets oxygenated blood from the lungs. From the left atrium, blood flows into the left ventricle, and from the left ventricle, blood is forced into the aorta and gets distributed throughout the body. So that was the general pattern of blood flow and the chambers of the heart. Again, the 2 YouTube videos that I posted, those are my anatomy review videos. You might find those really helpful. Okay, talking about the valves. There are 4 major valves that students must know. The valve between the right atrium and the right ventricle right here, this is called tricuspid valve. This is your tricuspid valve. And these valves are attached to these muscles. Do you see these muscles? These are called papillary muscles. And the valves are attached to the papillary muscles by these strings. These strings are called chordae tendineae. So the strings are chordae tendineae and the finger-like muscles are papillary muscles. Between the left atrium and the left ventricle, we see another valve here, and this is called the bicuspid valve. So we have tricuspid, this is tri, and this is bi. How do we remember? We always try before we buy. All right, so these are the tri and bicuspid valves, also known as AV valves or atrioventricular valves. We have 2 other semilunar valves associated with the heart, and those are right here. This is the pulmonary semilunar valve, and this one right here is the aortic semilunar valve. Aortic semilunar. The pulmonary semilunar valve lies between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk, and the aortic semilunar valve is located between the left ventricle and the aorta. So 4 valves. All right, so these are my 2 YouTube videos. They are actually made for my anatomy class, but I really want you to review the basic structures and the blood flow through the heart. All right. So here we will learn about systemic and pulmonary circulation. Now, let's look at the diagram here. in this diagram, we do see the human heart, right? We also see the lungs on either side, and we see some blood vessels that carry blood to the heart, that carry blood to the lungs, back into the heart from the lungs, and some blood vessels distribute blood to different parts of the body, right? So we see a network of blood vessels here. So let's point out some very important things here. Now, let's look into the right ventricle, which is right here. So, right ventricle gets deoxygenated blood, right? From the right ventricle, the deoxygenated blood goes into the pulmonary trunk. Then they travel to the lungs, where gaseous exchange take place. And the blood then comes back into the left atrium, right? So this circuit, right ventricle to the lungs, back into the left atrium. This is pulmonary circuit. Right ventricle to lungs, back into the left atrium. Pulmonary circuit. Okay, or pulmonary circulation. Then, again, listen to me carefully. Blood, so the right atrium receives oxygenated blood. Sorry, the left atrium receives oxygenated blood. From the left atrium, blood moves into the left ventricle, which is this chamber right here. Listen carefully, from the left ventricle, blood is forced into the aorta and gets distributed throughout the body, and the oxygen is dumped into the tissues, and then carbon dioxide is picked up, and the deoxygenated blood then moves back into the right atrium. So movement of blood from the left ventricle to different parts of the body, back into the right atrium. That is the systemic circuit. All right? All right. So let me write this down. Right ventricle to lungs, back into the left atrium. This is pulmonary circuit. And then left ventricle to aorta, to different parts of the body, back into the right atrium. This is systemic circuit. Alrighty, moving on. Okay, now there are two heart sounds that we actually talked about this during lab lecture. I talked about this in my lecture, and Professor Lovero talked about this in her lecture. But two important heart sounds that students must remember, and these are lub and dub. Lub is the first heart sound that is produced by the closing of the AV valves, the bi and the tricuspid valves, and this occurs when the ventricles are contracting. In this regard, two terms, systole and diastole. Systole is a fancy term for contraction, and diastole is fancy term for relaxation. So, when the ventricles are contracting, can you imagine the ventricles contracting? When the ventricles are contracting, it'll push blood out of the ventricles, right? So due to that increased ventricular pressure, the AV valves, which are the bi and the tricuspid valves, are shut closed so that blood cannot go back into the atria. No. Blood can only move in unidirectional pattern, right, in the human heart. So when the ventricles are in systole, the bi and the tricuspid valves shut close to prevent the blood from getting into the atria, and that produces the first heart sound called the lub. All right. Now the second heart sound is called dub, and that is produced when the ventricles are in diastole. So when the ventricles are relaxing, they're just relaxing, And when the ventricles are relaxing, what is happening? The semilunar valves close because the ventricles are being filled by blood passively, right? So when the semilunar valves close during ventricular diastole or ventricular relaxation, we have the second heart sound called dub. Talking about heart murmurs. Now, what are murmurs? Murmurs are abnormal heart sounds produced by abnormal patterns of blood flow in the heart. Many murmurs are caused by defective heart valves. For example, the aortic valve stenosis the aortic valve stenosis stenosis occurs by calcium deposits on the aortic side of the valve, and that can produce actually mid-systolic heart murmur. Defective heart valves may be congenital, or they may occur as a result of rheumatic endocarditis associated with rheumatic fever. In this disease, the valve becomes damaged by antibodies made in response to the infection caused by Streptococcus bacteria. Many people have small defects that produce Many people have small defects that do not produce any significant problems in their body, but they and a lot of people actually live with these defects for the rest of their life. Larger defects, however, may have dangerous consequences and thus may require surgical correction. All right, let's talk about mitral stenosis. Mitral stenosis, for example, in this case, the mitral valves become thickened and calcified. This can impair the blood flow from the left atrium to the left ventricle, and accumulation of the blood in the left atrium may cause rise in the left atrial and pulmonary vein pressure, resulting in pulmonary hypertension. Really, really important. You must remember this. And to compensate for the increased pulmonary pressure, the right ventricle grows thicker and stronger. So that's mitral stenosis. I might ask you one question on the exam on mitral stenosis, so make sure you know this. All right. Another problem is mitral valve prolapse, which is actually a most common cause of chronic mitral I'll stop here and then start with a new video.